Something like 13.8 billion years ago, there was a little event that you may know as the Big Bang, widely accepted as the beginning of our universe and the birth of the space-time fabric itself. But is this actually the case? What if time doesn't have a beginning or an end? What if time has always and will always be there? Let's find out in today's episode of The Inexplicable. Hello and welcome to the Inexplicable podcast, the only place in the known universe where leaving with more questions than answers means you're heading in the right direction. In today's episode, I want to look at an ultimate question and something that has and still does perplex the minds of even the world's best scientists, which is, what is time? Now, before I go any further, let me just clarify that by time, at least in the first half of this episode, I'm not referring to the measurement of time with a clock, but rather the concept of time as a dimension or as an experience that we feel and that's inevitable. So instead of hands on a clock, think Interstellar movie ending. So we're going to look at things like the Big Bang, the relationship between space and time relativity, time perception, and how that can be distorted. And you know what? Whatever else that we need to try and wrap our heads around this. So, without further ado, strap yourselves in and let's get straight into it. I think the best place to begin with this is to look at how far back our current physics takes us. So, thanks to the works of many great scientists like Hubble, Friedman, Gamow, Lemaitre, and even Einstein, we can trace our time back to a period called the Big Bang. The Big Bang itself is technically still a theory, however, it's almost unanimously accepted at this stage because we can actually see the light emitted from the Big Bang, which is known as the first light, or, in science groups, the cosmic microwave background radiation. And that is a mouthful. But now you know, if anyone ever asks you, well, why do you believe the Big Bang happened? You can reply with, well, we can see it. So what was the Big Bang? Essentially, it was the point where the universe transitioned from being a hot, dense point, also known as the singularity, which is infinitely small, to expanding and cooling to form the crucial particles and atoms that we have today. So stay with me here. I know this can all sound a little fantastical and hard to grasp, but I'm going to try my best to walk you through it like I walked myself through it. So with our current knowledge of the physics, prior to the event known as the Big Bang, there was something called cosmic inflation. This means the universe was in a state of exponential expansion. And when I mean exponential, I mean the numbers here are just spectacular. So if you imagine we begin at a fraction of the size of an atom, so really, really small, then within a trillionth of a second, the universe would have expanded to become larger than our known universe today, and the size of our universe is at least 390 billion galaxies. Now, to me, them numbers are just absolutely unfathomable. It's kind of one of those sentences that you can read and you can understand what the words mean, but you can't actually comprehend the scale of it, and I don't think we ever will be able to understand the sheer scale of our universe. I think that's just what makes us human. But that was cosmic inflation, and when this all stopped, the energy from it was dumped into space and formed all of the things we see up in the skies today. So your planets, your galaxies, your stars, your moons, and that's it. So inflation theory suggests that the Big Bang, which they redefined as the hot Big Bang, was not actually the start of our universe, but rather the end of inflation. Now, once you know about inflation, if you're like me, you'll be thinking, well, when did inflation start? And the honest answer to that is, we don't actually know. Using Einstein's theory, we know that somewhere along the line, there was the singularity from which inflation started. So that hot, dense point that's infinitely small, the singularity, that was somewhere along the line. Now, where along the line, we don't know. Beyond the point of the singularity, our calculations begin to fail. So, as of today, I feel it's safe to say, and although nobody has a firm answer on this, and if somebody does have a firm answer, they're probably lying, so beware of that. But most people tend to lean towards the singularity as the beginning of time, or meaningful time as we know it. And thus, asking the question, when did time begin, might not actually make as much sense as the sentence suggests. So, because if our maths fails beyond the singularity, then there is no other option but to believe it began at that point. Or I guess that it's an inherent part of the universe, or a property of the universe, or even a condition that's required for a universe to exist. Does time have to be present already for a universe to even come into existence? It's something to think about. And the problem with discussing the origins of time and the universe is that most of the conclusions are actually just theories. Now, there's some stronger and some weaker. So, although in this episode I've gone down the route that I personally believe in, which is cosmic inflation followed by the hot Big Bang, there are other theories to what caused the Big Bang. So you've got the likes of eternal inflation theory, or string theory, or even cyclical universe theory by Sir Roger Penrose, just to name a few. But because I'd like to keep this episode based mostly around time, I could dedicate separate episodes to those individual theories if people are interested, so I can give them the time and the effort and really research them at length rather than me just kind of brushing over them here. But to kind of wrap up the first section of this episode, I'd like to just say that if you're finding it difficult to make sense of this topic, then that's okay. That's probably where you should be. No one really understands this stuff. However, if you have the perfect picture of time in your head and you feel like you know exactly what's going on, then I'm afraid you're probably thinking about it a little bit wrong. So try and open your mind up and kind of just ask more questions. Now that we have a vague idea of where time may or may not have come from, I think it's only right to discuss its relationship with its brother, space. According to the theory of relativity, space and time cannot exist without each other because they're actually intertwined and make something called the space-time fabric. Space-time, I'm sure you've heard the word thrown about. It's best conceptualized as kind of a fabric that can bend around the things that are placed within it, with space and time being the coordinates used to locate and identify unique events. So for example, if you imagine a trampoline, if you were to go onto a trampoline and you were to stand in the middle, the trampoline mesh would bend and it would be lower where you're standing because your mass is on top of it. If you were to throw a ball in there now, the ball would circle around the outside of the trampoline, eventually falling in, but it would orbit basically. So if you want to uniquely identify an event in the universe, you need to say where and when it happened, ergo the space and time coordinates. Now, these aren't actually real coordinates, it's just easier to kind of conceptualize it that way. So if you've ever heard of time being called the fourth dimension, this is because you have the three spatial dimensions, which are X, Y, and Z, and then time is the fourth. I think a nice analogy that helps you kind of picture this, and I've actually heard this from Neil deGrasse Tyson, goes like this. You've never gone for a coffee with a friend if not at a specific time. The coffee shop being the space, and the position of the clock when you went being the time for us. And now the inverse is also true. You can't go for a coffee at 12 without being in a place in space somewhere. So space and time are integral and ultimately linked. Where there is space for events to progress, there is time. And where there is time for events to progress, there's space. There's an inevitable progression of events from past to present to future. And that's called the arrow of time. And that looks at entropy. You cannot stop yourself from going into the future. You're going there whether you like it or not, regardless of anything. So I will see you in the future, I guess. Now that is kind of the basics of the space-time relationship. The other thing that is important to know is, and I did briefly mention this earlier, but that is the effect of matter on space-time. The larger the matter is, the more it warps space-time. Like I give the analogy with the trampoline. So the heavier someone is, the more the trampoline caves in. This effect is what causes us to orbit the sun, basically. So in our galaxy, we have the sun in the centre, which is the most massive, therefore it has the strongest gravitational force and bends the fabric of space-time around it, causing us to orbit it. So Einstein's theory of relativity says that gravity isn't actually a force, but a distortion of space-time, as I explained before. The bigger this distortion means the bigger the gravitational force, which ultimately means time runs slower relatively. The way I find it helpful to imagine this is, picture 2 points on a piece of paper, and the length between the 2 points is measured with a straight line across. So imagine, you can even do this, for example, get an A4 piece of paper, draw 2 points on it at any distance, and then just join them with a straight line, and you can measure the line. Then imagine that paper was folded in on itself into a U shape. The points will then be closer together now than they were when the paper was flat. The bending of the paper, in this analogy, is the distortion of space-time that the matter causes. So this explains why time moves slow when gravity is larger. These concepts are based on Einstein's theory of special and general relativity. So, to recap, in very simple terms, big things make big dents in space-time. The bigger the dent, the slower time goes, because the distortion falls the fabric. Now that sounds nice and easy, I hope. Now, to finish off Einstein's theories for now, and there's plenty of them, I want to mention one last thing, being the link between speed and time. Relativity indicates that the closer to the speed of light that something is moving, the slower time will pass for them. Now, the tricky part comes when understanding that, let's say, for example, a man is on a rocket ship going close to the speed of light. Now, that's most likely impossible, as we know today, but let's say, hypothetically, he's going close to the speed of light. From that man's perspective, time's the same. His clock, if he was wearing one, would tick 1 second per second, and he wouldn't feel any difference in time. However, in relation to Earth, days, months, or even years will have passed if he was to return. The movie Interstellar does a stellar job, pardon the pun, at conceptualizing this. When Cooper returns back from his mission, he's roughly around the same age as he was when he left, but his daughter, who was then a child, has become an old woman now. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So if you haven't watched that movie yet, please give it a watch. I can almost guarantee you'll be fascinated. Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I think that's enough science jargon for one episode. I'd like to switch it up a bit and look at the short history of how we started measuring time and timekeeping techniques and how we started to use clocks. Not only that, but also how clocks and time affects us day to day, and ultimately what time actually means to us as humans. So if we want to look back at the measurement of time and timekeeping, we have to look back to 1500 BC to see some of the first sundials that were used by who other than the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what a sundial is, let me give you a quick rundown. So before conventional clocks, people used the tracking of natural phenomena to mark the passage of time. So the natural phenomena of choice in that time would happen to be the sun and the stars in the night sky. So essentially, what a sundial is an upright stick that's attached to a semicircular base, and the base is divided into 12 pie-like sections. So the sun shines upon the stick, which then casts a shadow. The shadow of the stick then indicates what the hour of the day is. However, as you can probably already imagine, the issue with sundials is that if the sun isn't shining, you might find it hard to tell the time because there won't be any shadow. That leads me nicely into the next development in timekeeping after sundials, which was actually the development of water clocks. Now, water clocks were essentially vessels, so a bucket, for example, with holes in that were filled with water, and then the outflow of the water would have to be at a constant rate, so it'd be the same flow of water coming out constantly, and that would measure the passage of time. So you could look inside it and see the level of the water remaining in the bucket, and that would indicate what time it was. And you could also use it the other way around. You could have a bucket with no holes in and water actually flowing into the bucket at a constant rate, and then you could also do the same thing. You could see the level of the water, and that would indicate the time. And the benefits of water clocks over traditional sundials is that you don't need to rely on the trusty old sun. These are also attributed to the ancient Egyptians, with the oldest surviving one being called the Hourglass of Karnak, which seems to have been used in the precinct of Amun-Re at Karnak Temple. However, something interesting to note here is that the Chinese actually claim that their historical records show the water clock being used as far back as 2600 BC by the Yellow Emperor. Now, the Yellow Emperor is kind of a half mythical, half real figure in Chinese history. There's no kind of real strong evidence that he existed, but none to kind of fully 100% refute it either. But on the topic of water clocks, there's no substantial evidence to back this claim, to my knowledge anyway. But if anyone has any refuting evidence, please email it to me. I'd be really happy to take a look at it. But yeah, so the next breakthrough came with the invention of the pendulum clock, invented by a Dutch scientist called Huygens in 1656, so the mid-17th century. Now, his invention was based on the works of the previous Galileo around pendulums, and the pendulum clock actually became the industry standard because what it did especially well was reduce the daily error that clocks were having at the time from around 15 minutes to merely a few minutes with the pendulum clock. So the pendulum clock was really ahead of its time, and it was fairly accurate for the technology at the time. So we've gone from shadows to sundials to water clocks, and then to pendulum clocks, which brings us to close history in the early 20th century. The next clock, you might have guessed it, the quartz clock, the first of which was built in 1927 by Warren Morrison and Joseph Horton at then Bell Telephone Laboratories in the US. Now, in these devices, an electric current causes a quartz crystal to resonate at a specific frequency that's far higher than the pendulum's oscillations. So the quartz was preferable over the pendulum any day of the week. And alongside the quartz, there was actually the atomic clock too. This came shortly after the Second World War in 1949 by Mr. Louis Essen from London. And I won't make things too confusing here, and I'll probably leave it at that. If you'd like to fully understand the mechanisms behind the atomic or the quartz, you can read up on it, and I think that's for the hardcore geeks out there, the geeks of timekeeping. But anyway, today we use kind of a mix of both quartz and atomic clocks. We use quartz in our daily lives like phones, watches, and our house clocks, for example, and then we use atomic clocks for extremely precise measurements like GPS. So I think that's a nice brief history to kind of bring you up to speed on timekeeping up until today. Obviously, I'm sure I've missed a ton of stuff and I've missed some details here and there, but there's only kind of so much I want to condense into this without making it just a boring lecture. So I don't know about you, but I feel like I've gone through an absolute minefield of hard to grasp concept and abstract things, and to be honest, even just researching this topic has been extremely challenging, especially from someone who doesn't come from a physics background. Now, granted, I have a bachelor's in biomedical science, but still, a lot of the maths and the concepts are still baffling to me. So if you've managed to get this far, give yourself a pat on the back. Regardless, I find it somewhat funny how something so abstract like time, the fourth dimension, the second ingredient of the space-time fabric, the hands on the clock, all of these different things, so complex and intangible, yet it dictates our every move. The entire world functions based on the hands of a quartz clock, essentially. And if you're like me, you must have had intrusive thoughts like, who decided we must start work at 9 a.m. and finish at 5 p.m? Why do we have lunch at noon or sleep around 10 p.m? And in my very humble opinion, the biggest industries, as always, they've found out a way to make it profitable for them, and they've made workers out of everyone. But this has always kind of bothered me, to be honest, and I guess there's different schools of thought on this, but me personally, I love the idea of waking up naturally with the sun and then sleeping with the sunset. And perhaps that's kind of idealistic of me, but tell me that doesn't sound peaceful, at least. But I suppose the argument against that would then be that nothing would get done, and when nothing gets done, this world descends to chaos. But I do believe there's still a lot of places that do live sunrise to sunset, you know, remote places, tribal communities, more kind of third world places, and that's something that kind of does actually appeal to me. And there's something strange that happens, and I know it's not just me that feels like this. A lot of the people around me and the people I speak to day to day kind of feel the same, is that time just feels like it's going so fast and it's almost leaving us behind. You can just never have enough of it. And I've noticed that almost everyone feels like this. It might tie into time's relativity. When people think about the past, they remember having more time. The days kind of going by slower and having more time to do things that they love. Now, I don't know if this is just us humans reminiscing, or there's an aspect of relativity or time perception that plays into all this. I guess it's something to think about anyway, I guess. Because even though for us we think of time being constant, as in 1 second is 1 second, a minute, and an hour is an hour, and so forth, there are moments where even we feel like time's changed its speed somehow, and it's kind of hard to put into words. But for example, when you're at work and you're really tired, you've had no sleep and you're hungry, time feels like it's slowed right down, and a second has now somehow become an hour. Or on the other hand, when you're really enjoying yourself, you're with your friends, you're with your family or loved ones, time just feels like it escapes you. So what do we attribute this to? I guess it's just our perception of time as humans, but part of me has a kind of a gut feeling that there's something more at play here. But who knows? Not me, definitely. But what I'm trying to say is that time can get overwhelming, and I think to finish this off, it might help to have a look at how some of the wisest men have addressed the problem of time throughout history. I think the first person I'm going to start at, and I don't think there's anyone better, is one of my favourite historic figures, and that is Marcus Aurelius, touted as one of the greatest leaders of all time. He said, "Every man's life lies within the present, for the past is sealed and the future is uncertain." I think this perfectly encapsulates the experience of time for us. I guess these types of quotes can mean different things to different people, but to me at least, it highlights just how important being present is, and to always let go of the past once you've learned from it. And I do think that's a key point though. You must analyse the past to some extent so you can become wiser, and you don't just repeat the same mistakes over and over again, of course. And in terms of the future, it's inevitable anyway. We are moving into the future. So what's the point stressing about things twice? You know, anxiously waiting for things to happen twice. You almost put yourself through them doubly. Now, and that's not to say you can't plan and really think about things. It's just there's a difference between planning and then just anxiously beating yourself up about the future. So let things flow freely around you, through you, past you, because it's the future's inevitable anyway. And in terms of the future, it's inevitable anyway. We are moving into the future. There's nothing we can do about it. So what's the point stressing about things twice? And before you think I'm saying don't plan things and don't think about things, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a difference between planning things and being optimistic and stuff like that, and then anxiously waiting for things and putting yourself through the stress and the trauma. Because remember, your body can't tell the difference between the real thing and the thing in your mind. So let everything flow freely around you. Take all experiences as they come, because remember, being human doesn't mean being happy. Being human means feeling all human emotions. That's happiness, that's sadness, that's confidence, that's insecurity, that's excitement, that's fear. All of it is the human experience, and what a shame it would be to end this experience without feeling a range of all of the different emotions. And I think that's what makes life beautiful. Another really comforting idea was something I actually heard Brian Cox say at an event. It went something like this: no matter how insignificant you may feel sometimes, or how small you might feel, every move, every decision you make affects space-time itself. Truly think about that now. The universe changes every time you move or make a choice. So not only are we important and potentially the only species in this universe, I think we severely underestimate the effect we have on the universe too. And on that note, I think this is a nice place to end things for this episode. We've covered a hell of a lot of content in this, and ultimately I hope I've at least broadened your view on time and got you asking a few more questions. I thought I'd start this channel off with kind of jumping straight into the deep end, and the thought process behind that was kind of that if I can successfully conquer a topic like time, which is so complex, it would kickstart my confidence, and I think I have done that. So now, before I let you go, I just want to say that if I've said anything wrong or anything that you disagree with, I'm more than happy to be corrected or to debate opinions. You can leave a comment or send me an email. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember I am just another curious human like you, trying to figure out what the hell is going on in this world. But yeah, apart from that, please leave feedback or suggestions of topics you'd like to be covered, and that would be greatly appreciated. I will try and get back to everything. So that's it from me. I will catch you next time.